Hi, I'm Steve Anderson, and this is Lorraine Jacobs, and this is the 9th of November, 2009. We're here in Hudson, Wisconsin, at the old Lemuel North house at 3rd and Orange. But we're here to talk about the French and the Indians in western Wisconsin and the voyageurs and the relationships between those peoples. The Native Americans were well represented here in Wisconsin. Many tribes ultimately came to the state, and they left quite a legacy with us. It's estimated that there's between 15 and 20,000 Indian mounds created here in just Wisconsin. That's more than in any other state. However, most of those mounds left behind have been destroyed, and nowadays there's probably only something around 4,000 of these Indian mounds. The major tribes that were here in Wisconsin, about 400 years ago, there were 3 major tribes joined by a 4th one. The Menominee were here, the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk, and the Woodland Dakota. Shortly after 1600, the Ojibwa are driven west into Wisconsin from the east by the pressures placed on the other Indian tribes in the east by the white man's advance. By the first half of the 19th century, say about 1800 to 1850, additional tribes can be found here in Wisconsin because of this tremendous push from the east. Wisconsin became an actual traveling ground, moving from northeast to southwest, from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River, and many Indian tribes passed through Wisconsin, some of them staying, some of them being forced yet further west. Amongst those tribes that came into Wisconsin would be the Huron, the Petun, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Sauk, the Fox, the Kickapoo, the Mascoutin, the Miami, the Iowa, the Illinois, the Oneida, Stockbridge, Munsee, the Ponca, and the Montauk. But the tribe that we're probably two tribes we're going to look at most here are the Woodland Dakota, which were a branch of the Santee Sioux, and the Ojibwa, also known as Chippewa. Many of their descendants in Wisconsin prefer the name Chippewa to Ojibwa. The French were the first whites to really encounter the Native Americans, and they came here in the fur trade. First they came as explorers, but then the fur trade took over as the economic factor, and those Frenchmen and the Jesuits that followed them joined with the Indians and lived with the Indians and became adopted by the Indian tribes, unlike the English that followed later. In Hudson here, we had a number of French explorers that passed through on the St. Croix River, which is a short 2 blocks west of where we're sitting tonight. These French explorers opened up the trade routes and were soon followed by the voyageurs. It's possible that Radisson and Groseilliers, 2 famous French explorers of the Great Lakes and also founders of the Hudson's Bay Company, passed through here in the 1660s, but it's not known for sure. It is known for sure that Daniel Greysolon, Sieur Duluth, the man for which Duluth, Minnesota is named, came through here in 1680. The voyageurs followed him, establishing trading posts and trading routes and canoe routes through the area. And amongst those voyageurs that came this way were 2 interesting men, Louis Massey and Peter Bouchea. These are the 2 men that were really the founders of what ultimately came to be known as Hudson, Wisconsin. And Lorraine is here to talk to us tonight about these 2 men because she's a local historian who spent years studying them. But more importantly and more interestingly, I think, She's a relative of both of these men. And Lorraine, before we get into Bouchea and Massey, how is it you are related to these two men? Which is what to you?
Well, Louis Massey is my great-great-grandfather, and Peter Bouchea was his brother-in-law. So his sister was married to Louis Massey, so I'm related to both of them. He's my great-great-uncle, and Massey, my great-great-grandfather. And I got curious about them. Not them so much. I started to look and find what I could on what was Hudson like in this area. I live in the township. What was this area like before Massey and Bouchea came? I knew it was Indian Nation, but what was there around here? Anything different than it's been? And I discovered that it isn't different. The only difference is that the St. Croix River at that time was just a little river. We could teach him about the Indians.
The Indians in this part of the country were originally the Woodland Dakota,
right?
The Santee Sioux that were ultimately driven west. Mm-hmm. They departed here not only from pressure from the advancing Ojibwa, but also the advancing white men. And in a series of treaties, particularly two important ones, one in 1825 and one in 1837, they ultimately were moved west into Minnesota. But at the time that Bouchea and Massey came here, it probably right here in this part of the St. Croix River, it would have been the Santee Sioux that they first encountered, with Ojibwa coming into the area. Of course, these two tribes were traditional enemies and had numerous battles, but they both came to realize they had a bigger enemy in the advancing white man. But when do you think Bouchea and Massey would have first been coming into this area?
Well, they couldn't have come before, I don't think they came before 1826 or 7. And this is when they came down from that Selkirk Red River colony. And they had been living, Massey and the Boucheas had been living at Fond du Lac. That's Superior, not Fond du Lac, the present Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. But Superior was called Fond du Lac, and they had...
There's still a reservation up there.
Yes, there is.
Fond du Lac.
And this is where they were born. And Massey was passing through. He was working there for a fur company. I think it was the Northwest at that time. Is that the one that's become the American?
Yes, I believe so. By the way, Massey, of course, was older than Bouchea, although he lived longer than Bouchea. But if they came down here, in the first we think in the 1820s.
They first came in 1826 or 1827 that they settled. Massey came down in a Red River cart train. And a group had come down from there because of floods, and it had terrible times they had there. There were blizzards in the winter and drove the buffalo away, so they kept going further west to find food. So when they would go hunting, they couldn't find buffalo. In the summer, they had plagues of locusts. I hope we never see a plague of locusts because I read about them. They are something it's hard to believe. But they devastated everything. And then with the heavy snows, and when they melted, these floods were horrendous. They would flood for miles across. It must be flat country. I know when you hear about the floods at Fargo and Moorhead now. And so finally in 26, they'd had enough. So they joined. I have been told that Massey led the train, but I haven't proved that. But about 250, 60 people came in that group. Now here they were, all these people in these Red River carts. It is some picture. Poor things. You go as fast as the oxen would go. They brought their herds with them, whatever they had. The carts were loaded with their implements or whatever they brought. So everyone walked.
Well, the carts were all wood,
Yes, all wood.
and the axles had to be greased every few miles because there was wood on wood. And I've read that the squealing, the noise was horrendous.
You could hear it for miles.
Yes.
They knew when a cart was going through.
But now they came down here originally to settle or to work?
Oh no, they just came here to get away from there. They had heard that some people had been accepted at the fort. Now, there was only 9 square miles of land that the white man could be on legally.
Fort Snelling.
Fort Snelling. Zebulon Pike had arranged with the Indians, or treated with the Indians, for that much land. The rest was Indian Nation, so the Indians didn't care about them being there. They just liked it. But they heard it was a refuge for them, so they came down here also. And Josiah Snelling befriended them, and he couldn't see anything wrong with him helping them. Some of them, they didn't plan to stay all the time. Some were just passing through or going on further, but they had to rest a while. Well, some stayed, as Massey did, for 13 years.
Well, didn't ultimately both of them get hired to work at or around the fort?
Yes, they did. Bouchea worked for Sibley, who ran the Western Division of the American Fur Company. And he worked for him, and Massey did too. I have to consult my notes here. In 1837, in July, Massey contracted with Sibley to carry the mail for the fur company to Prairie du Chien. Well, he didn't go to Prairie du Chien, he only went down to Augustin Rock's house. And he met the man coming up from Prairie du Chien, and they exchanged mail. In the wintertime, he'd go on the ice, and however it was. And he contracted with him for 1 year in 1837 for $275. Now, that sounds like a lot of money for them, don't you think?
Yeah.
So I learned recently that Frances Bouchea Massey, Peter's sister, worked in the Fort Snelling Hospital. She had a government job, and they liked her. She was held in high esteem, they said. Another thing about Frances, they said she was a beauty. So she had some French in Chippewa blood. And she was well liked, and when they had gone after the treaties, when they had gone to collect their scrip, which was usually a couple of years after a treaty before it was ratified, all of the chiefs knew of her and held her in high esteem. Isn't that interesting?
It is.
I think that's just fascinating. And, for a woman to have a job, even a nurse at a military. Well, anyway, so they all had occupations, and they had a lot of interaction with the authorities at the fort. So they were well known.
Well, now weren't both Massey and Bouchea also guiding officers and visitors to Fort Snelling over from the fort to the St. Croix River area here on hunting and fishing expeditions?
Oh, they did. They took them up the Willow River. They took them up the Apple River.
Okay.
Now, I assume this, of course, was in neutral territory. The Sioux and the Chippewa finally had a treaty and agreed that there would be a section of land where they could both go and not war. Well, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
But the Apple and the Willow are in that territory. Because I wondered, how could they take these officers, only the officers from the fort went hunting, and they guided them, but they could speak Chippewa, so they could, converse if they met anyone. So they were familiar over here. And at the time that the squatters, they like to call themselves settlers, which they really were, they really turned out to be. Oh, that's another interest. I should do that later. I want to go everywhere at once. But where was I?
Well, if we take them up through the 1820s into the 1830s, and they're coming over here to the river area in what is now western Wisconsin, the Apple and the Willow, along the St. Croix, that both feed into the St. Croix River. But didn't Peter Bouchea do some guiding out west?
Yes, and that's really interesting, because Sibley paid the wages for Massey for his mail contract, and Sibley paid the wages for Peter Bouchea when he was voyager. He was recommended by Sibley and some military man, I can't think of his name right now, to voyage for Joseph Nicolay and John C. Fremont when they were on their excursion of 1838. They had another in 39. He didn't accompany that one, but on 38. He was out 88 days, and he got $88.
So I understand that Peter Bouchea guided for Fremont out west, and it was 88 days, and he got $88. Do you know how far west
No,
he
I
went?
don't. I don't. It went. This one went into the middle, what is now Minnesota. It wasn't then, but what is now Minnesota. And they went to Pipestone Quarry. That was a notable
Oh, yeah.
exploration. They
An
went to,
unusual place where the Indians did not fight each other, but all came to quarry the pipestone rock to make things, particularly pipes.
and they said no one could go there. As you approached it to enter it, it was a huge cavern or open mine, and all around was the granite or whatever the pipestone was. But they said whenever you enter it, there is thunder and lightning. And they had told that to Nicolay on his way up. And sure enough, when they were about to enter, they got such a storm and lightning and thunder carried on. So it was very impressive to them. It happened again at a later time when another one entered that testified, did the same thing for them.
But he returns from that expedition,
Yes.
and this is in 1838.
Yeah, 38, late 38.
Now, that's the year that you believe that the two of them came to Hudson.
Yes, you see the treaty was in 1837, right?
Yes.
And it wasn't ratified
Right.
until later, late 39. Well, you see, before this went on, there was gossip. And you know, it was like the Moccasin Telegraph. They knew things up in Lake Superior that happened down in Prairie du Chien. It traveled fast on the river.
Well, people knew about the treaty and what
Oh.
had been proposed, and I'm just, they would get ready.
They're all staking out where they
Yes,
wanted to build.
they're getting ready to come
So-
in here, and even coming in early.
Yeah, well, very early. And that was a problem with Plimpton. He became the commander at the fort, and he wanted some land too. Well, they were having a terrible problem with the liquor, with the Indians. They had grog shops all over. But, you know, the French traded with the Indian and used liquor for the trade. That's what the Indian preferred, was the liquor.
Well, and the English certainly used liquor as
Yes.
well, possibly even more often than the French did.
So it started there. And then it was lucrative because, you know, and the soldiers too was a problem. But so then Plimpton, as soon as he became commander, he relieved Snelling. And when he came up and saw these people living on the fort property, he didn't like it. And he started then planning to get rid of them. But then this land desire got in the way with him also. So he was plotting and planning to find some of this property around here for himself. Anyone in the service couldn't own property at that time. So he was conniving and I think he connived with Steele, I can't remember his first name. And they went out, and if you went out and built a little shack, that was an improvement, so that was your stake. You had that property. Well, He had that on his mind as well. So he didn't know how he was going to circumvent that, so he decided that they would enlarge the fort. It was 9 square miles. He wanted to enlarge it 20. That would go far enough down where it would take in all the spots where the whiskey dealers would remove them, but it would remove all these choice spots where the people wanted to settle, including himself. Well, the government didn't go for that. He wrote the letters and appealed, but the government didn't buy it, so it remained the size that it was.
But isn't he the one that had a big house cleaning then at the fort, where he got rid of a lot of the hangers-on and effort to...
Oh, he got rid of everyone. By 1840, see, Massey, along with Pig's Eye Parent and a lot of the others, they knew ahead of time what was they knew in 1836 that this was going to happen. There was talk of it, and so they knew. In the meantime, they had all staked out their property. Pig's Eye went to St. Paul, started St. Paul. Massey came over here. He knew about this area, and so they did that in 1838. Now, in the spring of 38 is when they came over here, and if they had, what did they live in? They built something. So
Well,
a shack or something that they could live in.
The Ojibwa and Woodland Indians could easily raise a wigwam, a bark-covered house and brush and trees. The teepee is associated with Native Americans, but that's really a Plains Indian device. Otherwise, yeah, they'd be building shacks, perhaps on the...
But to make their claim.
Yeah, you had to have some sort of structure.
Yeah, so they
on
put
the
up
property.
whatever it was. But then, you know, until 40, when they were no longer absolutely allowed on the grounds, they
Of
were
the
going
fort.
back and forth.
Yep.
They had friends, they had jobs, they did everything. They didn't have anything over there. The food, you know, everything, they still depend on this. So that, they were just back and forth all the time. In the meantime, they were building their cabin and enlarging what they had here.
So by 1840, both Massey and Bouchea are over here in what's called Willow River, and they have pretty much divided up what is present-day Hudson between the two of them in terms of land ownership. It's my understanding that there was sort of a diagonal line from downtown by the lakeshore running to the northeast, and Massey had land on one side of that line and Bouchea on the other. And then they began selling off plots to the earliest settlers, which were, although there were still some French, of course, coming into the area, some of the earliest ones were English, and were buying these plots from both Massey and Bouchea.
I just looked at some of those records. You know what the lots were selling for?
No.
They sold from $50 to $250.
Gosh. I wonder which ones were
I would assume Lakeshore would be more. I don't know. Or maybe they wanted the timber or whatever.
Yeah, I wonder if it wasn't something like that. Although the town was only just beginning here, so
It was a settlement. It wasn't even a town, it was a settlement.
but we didn't. Hudson really didn't get on the map in terms of trade. The first steamboat up here is in the 1830s, but it doesn't stop here. It goes on upriver to the falls and such. But by the 1850s, of course, we do have a town developing. Now, do you know what Massey and Bouchea were doing by that time in the 1850s? Still here, still selling land?
Massey was here, and I don't know that he was doing anything but fishing and hunting, and he did do a lot of that. Bouchea advertised that he would guide and take them hunting, but he was also trapping, and he had, and he would go to Amory. Was one of his trading posts that he traded at, not his post, but one that he traded at. And he would go further north too, because his relatives were all the way up through Le Coudray, Hayward, and up to Lake Superior, where his friends and relatives were. He had friends and relatives all over. His mother at one time I had read was born in Coudray, but she was born in Fond du Lac too, so I don't know. You know how those records are.
Yeah.
You can't go to the courthouse and get that record.
Well, I kind of got the idea that Massey was, in the 1850s, was more of the property salesman, and that Bouchea was more of the hunter. They both owned property, but the Bouchea was also advertising that he would take people out on hunting and fishing expeditions and show them around.
He was much more active.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
was
Now he was the younger one.
He was, yeah, and he was. I think Massey was ready to retire about the time he came over here. And let's see, he was born in 1793.
Yep,
so,
and he died in 1887.
Yeah.
Although Bouchea, being younger, born in 1815, dies in 1875 at roughly the age of 60.
Well, he was shot, so that.
Oh, he was?
Yeah, he
Oh,
went up to
what-
visit a brother, or brothers,
No, I didn't know that.
and
What-
was shot up there. And I don't know why. I can't find. Somebody says Silver Island. I've looked for that. I've contacted all the areas up there. No one knows anything about Silver Isle. But I think he's buried at Fort William or Fort Edward.
Oh,
And I'm trying to
okay.
find that out.
Up
and
in
I'm just
Thunder,
not,
what's now Thunder
yeah,
Bay.
Thunder Bay. I'm just not getting anywhere. But that's supposed to be where he's buried. Yes, he went up to visit. You know, that was a calamity, and I'm arranging that in my timeline. He had been divorced. This is 75, and I think he was divorced in 73. And there was another calamity. I can't remember now what it was. And I thought, well, no wonder he went north to see his brothers. Everything was so sad, you know. And he went up there and was shot. Now, another thing I'm wondering about. There's no track. After he had gone on one of these excursions with John C. Fremont, after it was over with, he presented Bouchea with pistols. What do you call that?
Well, a matched set of
Yeah,
pistols.
in a green velvet
Gift.
box.
Yeah.
And he had that hanging on his wall along with his other trophies. Oh, wouldn't you love to see those trophies? I wonder what they were. His different guns, and what would he call a trophy? But they disappeared. Now, I wondered if he took those with him when he went up there and he was robbed or something happened.
Well, or upon his death, whoever might have, simply
if
helped
he had
themselves.
taken them with him.
Yeah, family or otherwise.
I don't think he had them yet when his house burned here.
Do you know where Bouchea's house was?
Well,
in Hudson area?
Yes, it was between the elevator and the Star Observer, where the
Down-
elevator used to be and the Star Observer
Right,
used to
so
be.
we're talking about down in Walnut and
Right on the water.
Street
Mm-hmm.
down there. Now, Massey, there's a plaque on a rock
Mm-hmm.
over at 1113 First Street that notes that it was on this site in 1840 that Louis Massey, Hudson's first white settler, had erected a home. And so we have him there.
The Women's
so-
Club did that, which I thought was very nice. Well, nice, not just because it was my relative, but that they would recognize the first settler here. So they did that.
What do you know about Massey's rest of his life then, after Bouchea's
I don't
death?
know that much about it. I know a lot about Bouchea, but I don't know that much about Massey. I think they just lived here. I know more about her. She made for Guy Daly. She had made him a pair of moccasins for 25 cents.
Wow.
And she had made, when they lived over at the Fort still, or Mendota, or whatever they would call it, they
Well,
called
of course,
it different
yeah,
things.
the people lived at the fort outside of it, and they lived across the river in Mendota, and a ferry went back and forth.
Well, while she was living over there, George Catlin, the great artist, came to sketch Indians, their dances, which he did, and all the different modes of the Indian.
Catlin had a brother who had a shoe store here in Hudson.
Yeah, Frank.
I'm not sure
Frank
what his
Catlin?
first name
Yes,
was.
I
but
know, and I think
yeah.
he's been here in town, George Catlin. And you know this, for this group of people that came down from the Red River, that settled on the reservation, the Fort Reserve, are also considered the first white settlers of Minnesota. Now, what is interesting about that, where did the first settlers, white settlers in Minnesota, come from? They didn't come from the south, and they didn't come from the east. They came from the north. And they started with Lord Selkirk, who was a wealthy nobleman, Scotch nobleman. He bought out Hudson Bay fur. He was wealthy. And he decided to alleviate the pressures of crowded, not cities, but places in Europe. They were overcrowded. So he started a colony, and he subscribed and got a colony started up at Red River, the Selkirk Red River group.
Mm-hmm.
And they would come over in ships and settle up there. Well, it was the people that fled from his group down to Minnesota that became the first white people of Minnesota.
Well, and I think people don't realize how not only were the French and the Métis, which are the French and the Indians, the first people into this area,
Mm-hmm.
but for both Wisconsin and Minnesota, when the states were territories and official publications were printed, broadsides and pamphlets regarding government issues. It might have something to do with agriculture or politics or law, but they were printed both in English and French. And that's because there were that many French here, and that's what they were reading, and they weren't reading English. And the Indians were speaking French, and only later did they come to speak English. Into the 1880s, even in St. Paul, you could find businesses that had signs in the window that said French spoken here, because they wanted to do business. And although by that time the predominant population was English and English speaking, the French had been here before, and there was still plenty of trade to do with them, and they wanted them to know, hey, we still speak French, come on in. And I think people have lost track of that and don't realize that the French were so important to the settling and the exploration, the trade, and the settling of both Wisconsin and Minnesota.
And the Indians loved the French.
The
They loved them so much they offered their daughters.
well, the French
Well, sometimes
would,
they took them, but I mean,
the French were willing to join and live with the Indians
Yes.
and share their culture and not force their culture upon the Native Americans. And the French were just much more humane about this. And I think much of the Native American lifestyle the French found very appealing. The concept of family and the use of the land
Yes.
and that sort of thing.
You're right.
But when the English came, their approach was much more standoffish and frankly much more racist.
Absolutely.
And they just didn't want to join with the Indians.
right.
They were willing to deal with them in the sense of if they could make money, get furs, sell them tools and liquor, and take their land. But other than that, they weren't very interested in joining with the Native Americans. And of course, this attitude is what led to so many conflicts.
You know, I was reading something written by an Indian, and they said they prefer to be called Indian rather than
Native American?
Native American. They want to be called Indian.
I've run into both usages all the time, and I'm never quite sure what to use. Because of our international world, whenever I say Indian, of course, I'm always thinking of India.
Yeah, right.
And so then you need to say American Indian. And of course, the whole name is a misnomer in the first place because Columbus thought he'd come to India, which he hadn't. So that's why I frequently opt for for Native American.
Well, we almost have to converse with other people, but if you're with an Indian, they prefer the Indian.
Was there, back to Massey and Bouchea, is there anything more you'd like to say about these two guys? And how does exactly how does the line come to you? Your Lorraine Jacobson, your maiden name was Kronk. But how does that line work directly to you?
Well, with Louis Massey, he married Frances Bouchea. She had had 2 white husbands before she married Massey, and she had lost 3 children, babies, and that distressed her. And she, while they were still at Fort Snelling, they had a son born to them, Pierre, in '39, and he died. And he, in Tolliver's papers, he says, Massey came to me and wanted to know if he could bury his child in our cemetery, which he did. And I think because of that, she had him take her to Prairie du Chien, a 1,200-mile round trip through foot and water, and no settlements between, to have their marriage blessed by a priest, to be really married. She thought that is why she couldn't keep her babies.
Ah, okay.
So it was after that then, not long, because Pierre was lost in '39. They were already settled over here, but living over there, they still had their hut or whatever it was. They had a farm, you know. And lo and behold, she got pregnant and had a daughter, Dorothy. And Dorothy lived. She married Richard Pickard, and they lived in Somerset, you know, that French community.
Mm-hmm.
And they had 7 children, and she died with the birth of Joseph. Richard Pickard lived for 5 years taking care of, 7 children? Pair of twins in there. My grandmother was one of the twins.
Okay.
My grandmother was Elizabeth, and her twin was Elias. Grandma was about a little over 5 feet, and Elias was 6'4". So, and then Richard came back to Hudson to make a living. They had been living in Somerset. I have not found out why or the particulars on that yet. And then he came back to Hudson, and he had met Agnes Belargen, evidently in Somerset. But they didn't marry until 5 years after he was widowed. And then they had 3 children. So we have some step families. Well, Elizabeth married Jasper Kronk.
Okay.
She'd gone up to Marine on the St. Croix and to see her sister, I think, her sister Delia. Her sister Delia had married Lidström, a Svenska, in Marine. And there she met Jasper Kronk, a Dutchman.
Dutch, okay.
But he had been raised by a Swedish family, so he spoke Swedish fluently. Grandpa did. I didn't know that because he spoke so little. I don't remember him talking very much. And so Dorothy had Elizabeth. Elizabeth then had Richard Kronk, my father.
Okay.
So that is my connection there. And of course, Bouchea comes right along with Francis, you know, all of the connections because he was the brother-in-law, and then he was began to be the uncle and the great uncle, and the great great uncle.
Okay.
So we have, and you know, when I was young, I didn't understand it. Well, even the family didn't want to acknowledge the Indian. In those days, they didn't.
Most
of them didn't.
There's a long history of that
Yes.
in what would be the
denial.
Métis or the mix of white and Indian, where it was unpopular to acknowledge their Indian
It was denial.
background. I
So
think that has changed.
I think it has too, and I would hope so.
Yes.
Because I like it. I love it.
Yes.
I was hoping when I started getting into this that I would find that they were more than a quarter Indian, and I think I'm finding they're more half blood than quarter blood, but they're still considered half blood or
Well,
half breed. They don't use half breed so much as half blood anymore.
Yeah, the term half-breed, of course, was so popular in the 19th century. Has come
And
to
squaw,
be,
they don't use that anymore.
both pejorative terms
Yes.
these days.
Well, and it was a term, you know, a little derogatory. The people thought that we're using it. When I was little, of course, everybody in the community knew. And there was a boy up there, and when he felt like being mean, I guess, he would call me Indian. And I thought, you know, I couldn't figure that out. And I thought, why is Dick calling me Indian? But you know, I never went to my folks with it, because I thought, the way he said it, it sounded like it was bad.
I'd have just told him thank you.
I know. Oh, now I would. I may still have the chance. He's still living.
Yeah, well, then do that.
But I didn't go to my folks because I thought, well, if it's something bad, I don't want to say anything bad to them. But I never forgot it. And then the more I began to find out about it, I thought, yes!
Was there anything in conclusion that you'd like to say about Louis Massey and Peter Bouchea, Hudson's true founders?
I don't know if I could wrap it up. They didn't come here with wealth, you know, like the Easterners did and the capitalists did that came here, and they came with fortunes, but they also made fortunes.
Yes.
But they were a simple people that were happy with nothing and made do. They ate off the land, they lived off the land, they loved the land, and I have such admiration for their chutzpah. You know, it was life or death with them, but I don't know them, and I just love them. And no matter what their faults are, I don't care.
Good.
I just love them, and I would love to be able to talk to them and hear some of their adventures.
Oh, yes.
And I know they had them. Peter Bouchea, as a boy, was shot by another Indian boy. I suppose they were playing with guns, and they sent him to
Michilimackinac.
Yeah, Mackinac, and to be treated. Bouchea
Whoa.
was injured in the 1812 war. He served under that famous Robert Dixon, big fiery redhead, and he got these Indians and voyageurs to fight for the British in the War of 1812 against his country. He was injured then, and Governor Cass of Michigan cared for him and healed him. They had, it's so many harrowing experiences that they had too, but wonderful.
And of
But
course, this has
Massey-
not been recorded anywhere. I mean,
No, but it will be.
Good.
I'm trying to ferret it out. And you know, there are countless history books that have them in. I said, I'm so fortunate doing I'm not a genealogist, but I had to get into it doing the history to get back into places where I couldn't otherwise. And I have so many books I pick up that my family's in. Well, the Cronks are in there too, but that the families are in, that I feel sorry for these genealogists that, you know, all you get are City Hall records. Mm-hmm. But they lived at the right time, at the right place, the beginning of Minnesota. They were first settlers in Minnesota, and they were first settlers in St. Croix County, Hudson, Wisconsin. They were living here when St. Croix County was formed.
well,
It wasn't a county. It came out of Crawford County.
and I'm glad they were, because it led us to you.
Well, thank
And
you.
you're leading us back to them.
Oh, that's the important part.